Hello and welcome to Stapleford Granary. I'm Kate Romano and we're here today to talk words, music and the poetry of John Clare. My illustrious panel have all been living with John Clare for many years. They are leading Clare scholar and writer Professor Simon Kövesi of Oxford Brookes University, composer Julian, who has found a beautiful and unique musical vocabulary in his song settings of Clare poetry, and actor Toby, one of the most recognised and much loved faces on stage and screen, and a lifetime Clare reader. We're here because we share a fascination for the synergy between words and music in John Clare's work. Clare was not just a poet, he was also a fluent and accomplished musician. In the 1820s, Clare pricked down his phrase, hundreds of folk tunes in books of fiddle music, immaculately notated in his own hand. And Clare's words have constantly inspired music in others too. And we're going to hear about this during the panel discussion. But first, Simon, can you explain the roots of this project and how it grew out of your own research?
Well, 1820 was John Clare's first book publication, so I wanted to try and do something to mark that, in 2020. And one of the interesting things in my research on Clare is that the first poem in that first book, Poems Descriptive of Rural Life and Scenery, is picked up immediately after the publication in January of 1820 and appears in an opera on the West End stage at Drury Lane Theatre as a song. So almost immediately it's in print, it's responded to by creative artists. So you get John Clare, who was presented to the market as the Northamptonshire peasant poet. His song is taken and put in quite an incongruous setting in the West End stage in an opera. And that poem then becomes something else across the 19th century and is a remarkable success. And so I wanted to do something with creative artists, but also to mark that 200th anniversary of Clare's first book publication and his first success. So that's the sort of genesis of the project.
So it'd be nice to get a flavour of this early collection, Simon. What have you chosen for us to hear today?
So we've chosen a poem that typifies a lot of Clare's poems. It's a love poem, but it's situated in the natural world. It's actually written to the woman that would become his wife later on in 1820. Had a little bit of a shotgun wedding in the middle of 1820, and his wife's name was Martha or Patty, and she became Patty Clare later on that year. So it's a poem that is about loving a woman, and Clare wrote an inordinate amount of love poems to women. We're going to follow that thread through the rest of this panel. So we're going to hear Toby read that poem.
Ye swampy falls of pasture ground and rushy spreading greens, ye rising swells in brambles bound, and freedom's wildered scenes, I've trod ye oft, and love ye dear, and kind was fate to let me. On you I found my all, for here 'twas first my Patty met me. Flow on, thou gently plashing stream, o'er weed beds wild and rank. Delighted I've enjoyed my dream upon thy mossy bank. Bemoistening many a weedy stem, I've watched thee wind so clearly, and on thy bank I found the gem that makes me love thee dearly. Thou wilderness so rudely gay, oft as I seek thy plain, oft as I wend my steps away and meet my joys again, and brush the weaving branches by of briars and thorns so matty, so oft reflection warms a sigh. Here first I met my Patty.
Simon, there's a particular poem which is at the heart of this project and this discussion, and it's called The Meeting. Tell us what's so significant about this poem.
Well, in some ways, it's like Patty. It's a three-stanza love lyric about a place, but it's the poem that gets taken up by musicians and by performers. So it's kind of its subsequent history that makes it really interesting. But it's also the the poem that the editor talks about critically, because it came late to the editor, John Taylor, in London, and so he slots it into the introduction and says this came late, and describes it and talks about the stanza form and talks about what the thematics are doing in the poem. But like Patty, it's a poem of love which is situated in a very natural landscape, in which the natural landscape takes on all sorts of emotional resonances for the speaker. And it's also a poem which, very typical of Clare, offers an opportunity to fall in love with a woman, but is really concerned about losing that love. In the moment of feeling the love, you also feel the loss. And that's quite typical of Clare's kind of grip on everything, really, that sense of loss. But it's more to do with the subsequent musical history of this poem, the reason we're focusing on it today.
And before we talk about that, let's hear the meeting read by Toby Jones.
Here we meet, too soon to part. Here to leave will raise a smart. Here I'll press thee to my heart, where none have place above thee. Here I vow to love thee well, and could words unseal the spell, had but language strength to tell, I'd say how much I love thee. Here the rose that decks thy door, here the thorn that spreads thy bower, here the willow on the moor, the birds at rest above thee, had they light of life to see, sense of soul like thee and me, soon might each a witness be how dotingly I love thee. By the night sky's purple ether, and by even's sweetest weather, that oft has blessed us both together, the moon that shines above thee, and shows thy beauteous cheek so blooming, and by pale age's winter coming, the charms and casualties of woman, I will forever love thee.
Now, that poem by John Clare, The Meeting, was, as far as we know, the first of Clare's poems to be set to music. Can you tell us something about that performance? Who sang it and who wrote the music?
So we know that on February the 19th, this poem was sung by Madame Vestris in her first ever West End performance in a pasticcio opera called The Siege of Belgrade. And so what happens with a pasticcio opera is the production company, or whatever you want to call it, would slot in the latest songs to refresh that opera, which had been a staple on the stage for 20 odd years. And Madame Vestris plays Lilla, who's a peasant girl in The Siege of Belgrade, and so they've given the Northamptonshire peasant poet's first love poem in his first book, and they slot it straight into the mouth of this new performer on the West End stage. She goes on to be a phenomenal success, but this song, Clare missed it. He missed it by just a couple of weeks. He arrived in London in March for the first time, but he was really moved by the fact that his poem had become song in an opera, and it's quite a remarkable thing, but it is the first setting of this poem, but not the last.
Julian, can you tell us something about the music of this setting?
Well, it's by a composer called Haydn Corry. The Corry family were Italian. They'd settled in London, a family of performing musicians. I think Haydn Corry's father was an opera singer. And his parents were so enamoured of the great Viennese composer Joseph Haydn that they named their son Haydn. And appropriately enough, Haydn Corry ended up being a composer and created this setting of John Clare's The Meeting. And the affinities with Haydn, the composer in Vienna, and Haydn Corry, the composer in London, go further, because in a way the model for this setting, I think in some ways, was Haydn's series of English songs that he made when he came on his 2 visits to London. And there is something very Haydnesque about this setting. It's very charming, it has a kind of melodic grace about it, and I'm sure if John Clare had heard it, he would have found it very delightful.
Let's hear it. Haydn Corry's setting of The Meeting, performed by tenor William Searle and Julian Phillips. So, Julian, what's Haydn Corry actually doing with Clare's words in this setting?
Well, it's very interesting. I think that he probably composed that song very much to the first verse, the first stanza of Clare's three-stanza poem, because it fits very nicely. But when William Searle and I were preparing that performance, you have challenges with verses 2 and 3 because actually the words don't really fit. And, as we heard with Toby's reading of the poem, there are all kinds of hidden complexities in the language that require a high degree of sensitivity on a composer's part in responding to the twists and turns of Clare's text. I mean, in a sense, I think in that setting, Haydn Corry, the composer, is at one end of the room, and John Clare, the poet, is at the other end. And they both have their own integrity, but they're not really talking to each other in an intimate or immediate way.
And there was a Rossini setting as well as the meeting.
Yeah, this sort of proves the point I've just made in a way, and it also speaks to what Simon was just saying about the success of Clare, the peasant poet, in 1820, in the publication of his first volume of poems, that actually somebody must have thought, oh, here's this very popular cabaletta by the great composer Rossini, the great opera composer, And wouldn't it be fun if I took this Clare poem and squashed it into this super popular Rossini cabaletta, and wouldn't that be a great idea? And what's so kind of shocking in a way, but also amusing about this, is that the original Rossini is a military aria. It's a battle song. So its kind of poetic topic is about as far away from a fragile love song about love and loss in a single moment. And actually, when you listen to the music, you'll hear all these dotted rhythms, all these sort of military topics. And there is a complete disconnect between Clare's poem and Rossini's music. And in fact, the words just don't actually fit, because the only way of making Clare's poetry fit the Rossini is to take the first 4 lines of each stanza and repeat them at the end. So, in fact, this setting not only, I would argue, destroys the sort of the lyricism and fragility of the original poem, it actually changes the structure of it. Because if I wrote it out on the page as it's set in the Rossini, it's a different poem.
Now, despite the ill-fitting words, that's an incredibly catchy tune. And in fact, it was the most successful and memorable of all the settings of the meeting, Simon.
Yeah, for some reason it gets picked up and it appears for about 50 odd years after 1820. It keeps getting recirculated via all manner of musical platforms. So we know it's in songsters, it's published on its own, it appears in kind of home tuition musical songbooks for learning piano and learning violin. And in the end, it's so well known that playwrights and short story writers and novelists can refer to Here We Meet, is what it tends to be called, and it's severed from John Clare's name almost entirely, but people can refer to it and everyone knows that tune, so actually it becomes known as the Here We Meet tune. So other songs are put to the Here We Meet tune, so actually the song becomes more famous than the Rossini aria. But it's remarkable that the places it appears in, it's everywhere for 50 odd years, and even becomes known and celebrated as a northeastern American folk original, as they gather the kind of the early American kind of folk songs and folk culture So its longevity and its significance is remarkable, and across high and low culture as well. It's clearly a song hall staple of the Victorian stage across the UK, and Clare pretty much never knew this. He knew about the Madame Vestris performance of the Corrie setting, which we've heard. He did not seem to know that it's everywhere. And that's quite remarkable and quite sad in a way. But it was his first poem published in his first book, and is pretty much his most successful poem.
And you've also discovered another setting of the meeting by a composer called John Waring.
Yeah, John Waring is pretty much unknown, but we know that this song was performed by a singer called Broadhurst at the Royal Opera House in London, probably in late 1820, early 1821. So this is the third musical setting. This one's an original setting of the poem. So people just didn't leave it alone.
Let's hear the John Waring setting of the meeting performed by William Searle and Julian Phillips. So we talked about ill-fitting words in the Rossini setting, but John Waring takes this a stage further, doesn't it? He really takes the poem apart.
He does. I mean, I wonder if this was just a vehicle for a famous singer, because as you've just heard, there's something very performative about it. There's something almost comic about that setting. It feels, William and I were saying when we were preparing, there's something a bit sort of foppish about it in its manners and gestures. But I mean, it's pretty brutal with Clare's poem. I mean, he just drops a couple of lines in a rather random way, and it has this sort of weird rhetorical heightenings around, I'd say how much I love thee, which is so out of spirit with the poem. I think of the three settings we've performed, it's the least sensitive to Clare's poem.
Julian, you have a real affinity with Clare's poetry. I know that you've loved it for years, and you've described a very particular rush of oxygen to me that Clare's poetry releases in you. Can you explain how Clare has been and continues to be such a spark of inspiration for you?
The first thing I would say is I think John Clare is one of those poets that people cherish. They discover him and then he becomes a kind of life companion, and he gets into your soul and you find yourself dialoguing with him in so many aspects of his life and how that might resonate with us now. So that's an important thing to say. But I also think that because Clare was a performing musician, as you said earlier, because he was a violinist, because he was fascinated by folk song, folk tunes, there's a profound musicality in his work. Sometimes a musicality of an almost metaphorical kind, sometimes a musicality which is to do with language and the sound of words, but in other contexts, a musicality where his poems really seem to be inviting a composer to come along and respond. We've been talking about the meeting, and it's fascinating to see all these different responses. And, I look at this poem and I'm planning a setting of it, because I, like Haydn Corrie and like John Waring, I kind of read that poem and it speaks to me in a very musical way. And of course, when I hear Toby read that poem, Toby, I hear you making choices about emphasis, about weighting, about internal rhythm, about the sound, associations of different words. And that's very analogous to my own fascination for Clare as a composer. I read his poetry and it provokes musical responses.
Toby, do you hear music in Clare's poetry in the same way? Do you hear it in the cadences, the phrases, the shapes, the textures?
I don't know if it's the same way. I certainly, the repetition of here, for example, seems to be, it's so direct and urgent, and it's about what is happening right now. But there also always seems to be in Clare's writing something pushing to what's already gone, what's already lost, what's already finished, as Simon was saying. And I suppose that there's that twin thing of twin impulse of one going forward all the time and looking at what is happening now in front of him in the present, but also sort of there's this drag of yearning backwards to what is being lost, what's being forgotten, and in other aspects of his work, boundaries forming around open spaces. And that is sort of in the form of the poems themselves, that you're looking for space and yet you're constantly being pulled back into it. And that's why I suppose the content and the form are so intimately linked, but they're not always the easiest poems to find a consistent way through, in a way.
Julian, one of your most recent settings of John Clare is the Love Songs for Mary Joyce. Tell us about that.
Well, this is a piece that sets 6 poems by John Clare, and these are much later poems than The Meeting. We're jumping ahead 20 years, and each of them is a love poem, and they're threaded together because they're all poems concerned with a woman called Mary Joyce. We heard about Patty earlier on, John Clare's wife, and Mary Joyce was another really important figure in John Clare's life story. Simon, do you want to tell us about Mary Joyce? I think that would be helpful.
Sure, yeah. There is a long tradition, isn't there, in poetry of male poets holding on to an early love and writing poems to them. So Petrarch with Laura, Dante with Beatrice, and so on. And Clare seems to have taken this up in his own work from very early on in his career, all the way through pretty much until he died. He writes poems to Mary. Almost always it's a long lost love. Although, as we've said, love and loss are very much kind of partners in Clare's dance around this kind of work. Mary, particularly at moments of crisis in Clare's life, and this poem is written out of his first stay in an asylum, which starts in 1837 and ends in 1841. Mary seems to have been a sort of governing factor and a kind of lodestar for him. And when he decides to escape the asylum in Essex, it's Mary that he's heading for, not his own family and not his own wife, Patty. He doesn't seem to be actually delusional about much other than the fact that he's not married to Mary. In one of his poems, he talks about having 2 wives. But Mary seems to be the main, the constant kind of person he turns to in his lowest moments. And this poem, he really, I wandered many a weary mile that Julian set, is one of these poems which is heartbreakingly raw about the distance that he feels from this long lost love. It's probable that he didn't see her from the age of about 14 years onwards. And we know that she died in 1838. And so Clare is probably writing this poem after she died. And it's incredibly sad, really, in lots of ways. But there is also a tradition of poets writing not about the women they're actually with, but for idealised kind of characters, really. And Clare just returns to her again and again and again.
So before we hear the music, let's hear a reading of the poem in question. I've wandered many a weary mile, from Toby Jones.
I've wandered many a weary mile. Love in my heart was burning, to seek a home in Mary's smile, but cold is love's returning. The cold ground was a feather bed. Truth never acts contrary. I had no home above my head. My home was love and Mary. I had no home in early youth, when my first love was thwarted. But if her heart still beats with truth, we'll never more be parted. And changing as her love may be, my own shall never vary. Nor night, nor day, I'm never free, but sigh for absent Mary. Nor night, nor day, nor sun, nor shade, week, month, nor rolling year, repairs the breach wronged love hath made. There madness, misery here. Life's lease was lengthened by her smiles. Are truth and love contrary? No ray of hope my life beguiles. I've lost love, home, and Mary.
It's a very moving poem, as you say, Simon, and it resonated very strongly for me because I felt there was a melody buried in it. And I think this is where it's really important to remember Clare as a poet-musician, because many of his poems feel like lyrics for songs. As we've discovered, the meeting clearly had that effect immediately on composers in 1820. I come to this and it feels to me like a folk song. And there's this surface simplicity, there are 3 stanzas and they kind of have the same shape. But as we've heard in Toby's reading, there's all this complexity inside, all kinds of rhythmic shifts, all kinds of syncopations, also the repetitions of words which reinforce the sentiment are very, very intriguing. And so I suppose with this piece, I spent a lot of time looking at these words in a very forensic way, in quite an analytical way, to look at the internal rhythm. And my compositional response was, in a way, to write quite intricate rhythmic material in response to this poem, as a way, if you like, of creating the effect of freedom through the music. Because in a way, when I look at these settings back of the meeting in 1820, what frustrates me is it feels like the music is very deaf to the words. The music is tone deaf to the poem. And Clare is too great a poet for the music to be kind of ignorant of the implications of the verse. And what I've tried to do is bring this words and music not from either ends of the room, but put them in the same space and let them cross-fertilise. And I think this is the joy of Clare, in a way. I do think for composers, he can sometimes feel like he's giving you something of an assault course to go through to get to the lyrical. But I think it's important to do that in order to achieve a truly free and evocative musical response to the poem.
I've wandered many a weary mile, love in my heart was burning, to seek a home in merry smile, but cold is life's sojourning. The cold ground was a feather bed, truth never acts contrary. I had no home above my head, my home was love and merry. I had no home in early youth, when my first love was thwarted. But if her heart still beats with truth, will nevermore be parted. And changing as her love may be, my own shall never vary. Nor night nor day I'm never free, but sigh for absent Mary. Nor night nor day, nor sun nor shade, week, month, nor rolling year repairs the breach wronged love has made, the madness, misery. Life's lease was lengthened by her smiles, our truth and love contrary. No ray of hope my fate beguiles. I've lost love, home and Mary.
So as I hope you heard in that setting, the effect I think I was trying to create was this through line of the melody that the tenor sings, which is like an invented folk song, with the piano textures shifting around that line a bit like weather patterns or changes in landscape. And of course, this points up one of the great qualities of Clare's poetry, which is his engaged, profound relationship with the natural world and place and landscape.
Yeah, so we've looked at 3 love lyrics from early in his career and much later. But actually what we're missing, although they all have natural metaphors and motifs and settings, is the fact that Clare's, the reason we celebrate him so much at the moment really is to do with his acute sense of the natural world. And so what we need to do is end our discussion today with a poem which actually gives a much more expansive sense of Clare's very rich, very detailed, very localised engagement with the natural world. And so we're gonna end with a poem which is from 1832, which is a really crucial moment in Clare's life. Before he ends up in the asylum, he moves from his village of Helpston just a few miles up the road towards the fens in a village called Northborough. And although he writes some super happy and contented poems about the natural world in that place, there are also poems of kind of real fracture and nostalgia and sadness. And Remembrances is this big, broad kind of canvas with very specific local details, which Clare's really celebrated for.
I mean, it's a fun poem to end on in a way, because this poem is full of music. It's a big, expansive poem, but actually it's so self-sufficient in its musicality that, if I would never pick this poem up and respond to it musically, because it's so full of music already, and it just points to the rich kind of breadth of Clare's poetry.
Yeah, it's one of the poems that's really excited about sound and uses sound in all kinds of ways, so I'm sure we'll hear that in Toby's reading.
Summer pleasures, they are gone, like to visions, every one, and the cloudy days of autumn and of winter cometh on. I tried to call them back, but unbidden they are gone, far away from heart and eye, and forever far away. Dear heart, and can it be that such raptures meet decay? I thought them all eternal when by Langley Bush I lay. I thought them joys eternal when I used to shout and play on its bank at clink and bandy, chock and tor and ducking stone, where silence sitteth now on the wild heath as her own, like a ruin of the past, all alone. When I used to lie and sing by old Eastwell's boiling spring, when I used to tie the willow boughs together for a swing, and fish with crooked pins and thread and never catch a thing, with heart just like a feather, now as heavy as a stone. When beneath old Lee Close Oak, I the bottom branches broke to make our harvest cart like so many working folk. And then to cut a straw at the brook to have a soak. Oh, I never dreamed of parting, or that trouble had a sting, or that pleasures like a flock of birds would ever take to wing, leaving nothing but a little naked spring. When jumping time away on old Crossbury Way, and eating haws like sugar plums ere they had lost the May, and skipping like a leveret before the peep of day on the roly-poly up and downs of pleasant Swardy Well, when in Round Oak's narrow lane, as the south got black again, we sought the hollow ash that was shelter from the rain, with our pockets full of peas we had stolen from the grain. How delicious was the dinner time on such a showery day. Oh, words are poor receipts for what time hath stole away. The ancient pulpit trees and the play. When for school o'er little field with its brook and wooden brig, where I swaggered like a man, though I was not half so big, while I held my little plough, though 'twas but a willow twig, and drove my team along, made of nothing but a name. Gee-up and hi and hoy! Oh, I never call to mind these pleasant names of places, but I leave a sigh behind. When I see the little mouldy warps hang, swaying in the wind, on the only aged willow that in all the field remains, and nature hides her face where they're swaying in their chains, and in a silent murmuring complains. Here was commons for their hills, where they seek for freedom still, though every common's gone, and though traps are set to kill the little homeless miners. Oh, it turns my bosom chill when I think of old Sneap Green, Puddock's Nook, and hilly Snow, where bramble bushes grew, and the daisy gemmed in dew, and the hills of silken grass like to cushions to the view, where we threw the pismire crumbs when we'd nothing else to do, all levelled like a desert by the never-weary plough, all vanished like the sun where that cloud is passing now, and settled here forever on its brow. Oh, I never thought that joys would run away from boys, or that boys would change their minds and forsake such summer joys. But alack, I never dreamed that the world had other toys to petrify first feelings, like the fable into stone, till I found the pleasure past and a winter come at last. Then the fields were sudden bare, and the sky got overcast, and boyhood's pleasing haunts, like a blossom in the blast, was shrivelled to a withered weed, and trampled down and done, till vanished was the morning spring, and set that summer sun, and winter fought her battle strife, and won. By Langley Bush I roam, but the bush hath left its hill. On Cowper Green I stray, 'tis a desert strange and chill. And spreading Lea-close oak, ere decay had penned its will, to the axe of the spoiler and self-interest fell a prey. And Crossbury Way, and old Round Oak's narrow lane, with its hollow trees like pulpits, I shall never see again. Enclosure, like a Bonaparte, let not a thing remain. It levelled every bush and tree, and levelled every hill, and hung the moles for traitors. Though the brook is running still, it runs a naked brook, cold and chill. Oh, had I known, as then, joy had left the paths of men, I had watched her night and day, be sure, and never slept again. And when she turned to go, oh, I'd caught her mantle then, and wooed her like a lover by my lonely side to stay. I knelt and worshipped on as love in beauty's bower, and clung upon her smiles as a bee upon a flower, and gave her heart my poesies, all cropped in a sunny hour, as keepsakes and pledges, all to never fade away. But love never heeded to treasure up the May, so it went the common road with decay.